Hi, everyone. This is Adriana.
And this is Tanya.
Welcome back to Closing the Gap, a social justice podcast that strives to find solutions to help us combat issues that affect our everyday lives. We're very happy to be back here and specifically for this topic. It's something that we've been talking a lot about recently, especially with everything that's been ongoing. We felt like it was very relevant to really dissect and go into what protesting is and the different forms of it because there's so many different ways and being able to practice forms of protest, and especially with what's been going on, it just felt like a very important topic to bring up. I know we were really close to it, specifically with the campus protests, living in New York, being so close to the protests that really started it all, Columbia University's protests in solidarity with Gaza. It felt like a very important issue and thing that we wanted to discuss. So we're really excited to dive more deeper into it. And I hope at the end of this we encourage all of you. You don't necessarily have to go out to every protest with, sign and march. I know that's not something that's everyone is able to do, but in listening to this episode, we hope to just encourage that you take any form of protest for whatever you feel passionate about.
Yeah, definitely. We've been protesting for quite a few years now. So we're coming at this with personal experience and just working with different types of groups, mutual aid groups, large organizations that put on these protests. So thankful for the organizers and their part in doing that and being able to host these events that we go to. And sometimes they're protests that march, sometimes they're just demonstrations or we meet up somewhere and stay in that specific site. So they do look different every single time. Sometimes it's not even necessarily a demonstration where people are speaking, but I've been to one where it was a vigil. So it was just candles lit up for the people who have passed away. This one was specifically for Black Lives Matter. So we were honoring Breonna Taylor's memory at the time and her life. And yeah, there's just different ways to do that. So we'll get into all those different ways, each one with a different purpose and intent, I say, but all with the collective goal of moving society forward, of making sure that progress continues to happen, of making sure that our voices are heard, and making sure that our politicians, our representatives know where we're coming from and know what we want so that policy can actually change. And not just government, but also institutions, our workplaces. There's plenty of protests and strikes and boycotts to change workplaces, to move labor rights. And that's why we have unions. So there's so many different ways and it's amazing, but it's almost too many that we can't talk about today. So maybe this would become a series. I don't know. But yeah, I think the point is that anyone, anywhere can get involved, no matter what your abilities are, no matter what your background is, and no matter what kind of rights you have, because we realize that people with a lot of rights, like I, for one, feel like I am pretty comfortable going out and protesting because I don't have Black skin because I live in the US. And so certain privileges like that, I feel comfortable going out to protest. That's not necessarily the case for everyone in different parts of the world and with different experiences. So we're just going to touch on the ones that we have experience with and that we know of that work. But of course, if there are more, please let us know so we can maybe make a new episode on it. And yeah, let's just get into it.
Yeah, and I think that's actually a really great way to kickstart a conversation. To your point, Tanya, we are very privileged to live in, yeah, although sometimes, it comes with certain limitations, but technically we do live in a free country being in the United States. So we are able to go out and having the freedom of speech, be able to go out and protest whenever we feel there needs to be a demonstration and there needs to be more. Typically, when you think of protests here in the US, you think of the marches that we have with people carrying signs and coming together, meeting at one certain location and walking throughout the streets of that specific city who comes together and just showing their elected officials like, hey, we don't feel like we're being listened to, so we're going to take up more physical space so that you become more aware of and visually see what we're asking for. And to your point, that's not necessarily a right in every country. Tanya and I have both gone to protests together specifically for Black Lives Matters Tanya, feel free to share your experience, but I feel like that really kickstarted my experience with protesting. I think that was my first physical protest that I attended. And since then, I've been feeling so much more motivated to, I believe I've gone to about 4 protests in solidarity for Palestine, and being able to come together and just see the collective agreement with others that feel the same way about what you're speaking up against is very powerful. But again, I understand you're not able to do that everywhere in the world. And that is a right that I value a lot to have, even though it comes with its limitations. You know, there are times that there can be risks that come with protesting, even though they are not as severe typically in the US. It is something to consider. Even being an able-bodied person, I just understand like how it's easier to attend physically in these demonstrations. But if you are able to, if you are like us in an area where you feel safe enough to attend these protests, whatever it may be for, whatever you feel passionate about, we are able to call our local officials, we're able to write in. But sometimes being able to take up that physical space makes such a difference and makes such an impact. We really do encourage attend a demonstration or a protest whenever you have the chance.
Yeah, and I think the reason why sometimes it feels so powerful to be in space is because, well, there's multiple reasons. For the person being there, so me, when I go to a protest, I feel reassured in my beliefs. I feel like the cause I am protesting for actually matters because it's not just me there, right? It's sometimes thousands of people. And you see that in the news because that's a phenomenon when people come together and work together in community, especially in such large numbers. That's what you're going to see on the news. If thousands of us call our legislators, that might not make it to the news because it's just harder to see that visibly. I mean, we don't really know what's happening behind closed doors. That's not saying that calling your legislators or emailing your legislators, especially in those numbers, doesn't create change. It does, and it needs to continue to happen. But I think that's why that protests, like physical protests and demonstrations, especially out in the streets that are very visible, that's why we just hear more about them because they make mainstream news. But as someone who has also this connection to another country, to Colombia, and who protests a lot on behalf of environmental issues, not just social justice issues, I know firsthand that there's a lot more freedom in protesting here in the US because in Colombia, that is the deadliest country as of the past few years for environmental defenders. And so I think about a lot that if I was living there at the time with the work that I'm doing, which is calling out governments, calling out institutions that are not taking climate action, I would be having death threats because that is a very real reality for a lot of people there. And people are dying left and right in Latin America and also in other parts of Africa and parts of Asia. But specifically in Latin America, it is the deadliest region for environmental defenders. And so having that in the back of my head, being someone who's in that work and who I've never received a death threat, like thankfully I've had that privilege, but I don't want to have that privilege. It shouldn't have to be a privilege. People should be able to speak up for whatever they want to talk about and wherever they are and speak out against their governments if they feel like their governments are not listening to them in their communities without having that threat at their doorstep. So that is, I think, what, at least where I'm coming from when I say that I feel like I do have the right to protest here in the US. Although I understand that right is not the same for everyone in the US. It also helps that I'm documented and that I have papers. I know even people who look like me and come from Colombia, if they don't have papers, they can't necessarily protest the same way I can because of that lack of documentation. And so there's just different nuances. And we talk about these privileges a lot in this podcast. And I think it's because we want to emphasize over and over again that we have our perspectives that we're coming with. And that's also another reason why we bring guests, because we realize our perspectives are sometimes limited. Besides that, in general, protesting, whatever way you can do it, is a way to show that you are contributing to society. That's the way I see it. Being a part of the democratic process and whatever space you can and whatever region you are based is just like being able to continue the democratic process, right? Being able to be a part of that continues that process and makes sure that that democracy doesn't die, that your voice is heard, and that we maintain these systems that we believe in. It's kind of like a need, because if we just treat it as something like that's nice to have, it's nice to vote or it's nice to protest, and we don't do it as often, then the democratic processes that are in place are just going to die down. So it's kind of our obligation, if you will, to be involved as much as possible in politics, because, I mean, one, we should want to, because those affect our lives, policies affect our lives, but also just thinking about all the other people that can't, or just because you want to continue the systems in place that actually work for us and make sure the ones that don't work for us don't get into place or are eradicated, then this is really the only way to do it right now, is to speak up and to keep speaking up until change happens.
We absolutely have a privilege and a need to speak up for any injustice. And whether it's doing that in the form of protest or not, it's a fundamental need as a human being. And without speaking up, no real change will be made. To emphasize just one more point too and add on, from personal experience, I know there's been times where I've wanted to attend a protest, but I'm afraid for an X amount of reasons. One of them being like, I don't have anyone to go with and I don't want to go alone. And I just really want to go back and emphasize how, in being able to exercise this privilege that you may have, and if you are able to attend physically, being able to surround yourself around like minded people, you'll be surprised at how welcoming these communities are and these people who are passionate enough to go out there themselves and speak up for what's right. You would be surprised. There have been times where I've gone alone and I felt completely comfortable. I found my people. So, whatever concern you may have, feel free to just that leap of faith and see how you feel. If you've never been to a protest and you're considering going to your first one, see how you feel. And I think you really might surprise yourself at how good it feels afterwards.
It really just sparks a fire under you. It really just ignites the spark that you have, that like that passion for, yes, this is going to make change and this is going to leave an impact. And it's a form of legacy. You're leaving a legacy behind by showing up with everyone else. And we've been doing this for decades, right? For centuries, people have been doing this. So this is how we got to where we are today, thanks to Indigenous people asking for land back. That happened for centuries and centuries, and sometimes they're barely just getting that. And so having that mentality in mind also, that change sometimes can seem slow. Like just because you go to one protest doesn't mean change is going to happen the next day. And unfortunately, that's how it is. But fortunately, we know that it doesn't end with us. Showing up in that collective space reminds us that this is going to continue as long as we keep showing up in these numbers. Then even after we pass away, even after we leave our legacy, the next generation will continue. And that's the beauty of it. As long as we keep leaving those resources behind, then we can make sure that everyone that takes over the movement in a way will know, okay, this didn't work and this did work. So let's continue what worked and let's innovate and work on what didn't work so we can really get to those results that we want. But there are plenty of safe ways to do it. You definitely should look into the organizations that have the biggest reputations. And I don't say that to say that small nonprofits or small organizations aren't experienced, but sometimes it is just best if you're just starting to go with big organizations that have bigger teams that are able to get more resources on the ground in case that it's needed, especially for large protests. You just want to make sure that it's an organization that knows what they're doing, because things can happen, unfortunately, and they know how to be ready for that. So definitely look into just reputable organizations, no matter how big or small. And we can put in the show notes links to guides on how to get prepared. I sometimes would just show up with like my sandals and like like just looking all cute. And sometimes you need to like have shoes in case maybe like something happens. And like there was once where we were at a protest where we had to switch routes. And so it was kind of sporadic and I didn't know where to go. And then they were like, we need to cross the street, we need to cross the street. And so I kind of ran. And if I had sandals in that moment, it probably would have been the best case. I probably would have fallen on my face. So even just things like that, like things just happen and we're all safe, thankfully, but you just want to make sure you're prepared. You're in comfortable clothing and, you know, if it's hot, you want to be with a hat. You don't want to be out in the sun for too long with no sunscreen, with no water. You need to stay hydrated. So small things like that that may seem like common sense. We can link to that in the show notes because it can feel like, oh, if I'm just going for the first time, how do I show up? You want to have the essentials, but not necessarily be carried down by all the stuff in case you do need to do something like what I had to do, which is cross the street last minute in a very fast way. So yeah, I mean, that's what this podcast is about, just providing as many resources that we can, because we're not telling you to go take action without knowing how to do so. And if you can't do that, if you can't go out in person, protest online, use your social media account, use your network, make videos about it. Things like that are also protests. That's also like taking up space, and the internet world is another way to do that. And you can make art. I see a lot of protests that if you can't be there the day of, they will ask you to be there a week or so before for an art build. And so if you're good at painting, if you're good at using slogans, then show up for those events. And you don't necessarily have to put yourself too much out there. For example, that could be great for someone who's undocumented and you don't want to go to protest in fear of getting detained. That's totally fair. So go to the art build instead and create art that protesters will use on the day of. Just find different ways that work for you. One last way I can think of is joining days like Orange Shirt Day. Orange Shirt Day is where people just wear an orange shirt on a specific day to spread awareness for Indigenous rights. So those things can maybe seem not as dramatic, but that doesn't mean they're less valuable. It just means that they're different. And if you're walking around with a bright orange shirt that says Indigenous on it or something, maybe someone will say, hey, what's this about? And there you go. That's the conversation that needed to happen in order for someone else to recognize that cause and to then take action. So every action really does add up and really does matter.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And again, we really want to stress that protesting does not look like one way, certain way. I know personally, I think one of the best forms of protest is boycotting too. It's so simple, it's very effective. It's showing that, especially here, I know a lot of our perspective is coming from being in the US. Unfortunately, there's times where money just talks a little bit more. So being able to say, all right, then financially, I'm not going to support this institute or this brand, it speaks volumes. It really gets the attention of the people who tend to ignore the ask the most. So the ways and the forms of protest are endless. And to Tanya's point too, we've, especially within US history, there's been countless of protests that have made a lot of change. We have the civil rights movement, we have movements that have fought for gay rights. All of this took time, all of this took different methods that contributed all together to the collective positive result of change that was being asked for. So don't feel like any act is too small. Anything can make a difference, especially when we come together and, maybe you're doing one thing and then another friend is doing a different thing, or someone else within your region is doing something differently. Collectively, that coming together speaks volumes. I will say too, we would be remiss if one of the really driving forces of why we wanted to bring up this topic as well, aside from encouraging and just knowing that there's so many things now to protest for and to show solidarity for, we would be remiss if we didn't bring up the student protest and dive a little bit more deeper. I know I did mention it earlier of what happened in Colombia, and I want to call out that there isn't really an age limit to when and you can protest. It's so enduring to be able to see when we've gone to protests before where we've seen elderly people also marching and also taking those actions. But it does seem like a lot of the focus of protesting does tend to stem from student protests, and they've kind of been the forefront usually of igniting protests. And unfortunately, as we mentioned, there are limitations when it comes to being able to take action, and some people do face consequences. In the case with the student protests that were showing solidarity for Palestine, there was violent action that was taken against them. It was really disheartening to see the attacks of the students, specifically from UCLA, how at their encampments there were outsiders, not even students, but outsiders coming into the campus and physically attacking these students. That's more of a reason to speak out and fight for the rights of our protests, because that the majority of the protests that we're involved in and that we're speaking in favor for are these peaceful demonstrations, and these violent actions don't necessarily always happen, are out of the control like of the demonstrators that coordinated them. And it is a risk. Like we do want to call out that there are risks that sometimes occur, and why we want to share the resources of how to stay safe and how to better prepare yourself, because unfortunately these things do happen. But that shouldn't deter us from speaking out. If anything, we should. I think it just kind of, it does like motivate the people who coordinate these protests to be a little bit more resourceful and just being more prepared. There's ways, in the example of the UCLA students, it was outsiders, but there are times where even police brutality does occur at these protests. And although it can be deterring sometimes, it is part of the reason why there are times where I am a little bit scared, or like maybe I reconsider attending a specific protest. By all means, we want you to be safe. Definitely go based off, again, your comfortability, but know that the people coordinating keep that in mind as well. And most organizations, to Tanya's point, this is why we're stressing going with organizations that you're familiar with, that you know have done this before, because they're very aware of what goes on and how to be ready for these situations. As empowering as it is, we do want to also acknowledge that it's not always the easiest form of action to take. And that's also why we're stressing the different forms of it, because if you don't feel safe necessarily to attend a protest physically, there's these other methods to take.
And when we say we're advocating for peaceful protests, it's kind of that nuance. Like we understand things happen. There has been at least 2 or 3 protests that I've been to where the cops were right there, hands on the trigger. Like I was pretty scared. And so we understand that thankfully nothing happened in those cases. But in my back of my head, I'm like, I had to be prepared if anything does happen. And the first thing I'm going to worry about is me and the people I came with to that protest. Not that I don't want everyone else to be safe, but there's only so much you can do when violence occurs. You have to kind of just make sure that you're safe and you're out of there as quickly as possible. And so I'm not saying that I want that to happen, definitely not to anybody. And that's to either side. I think when I say that, it's like, we're not telling you to go out and protest, like, go out and find someone in the street that disagrees with you and fight with them. That could be obvious, but I just want to put that out there because we're not advocating for that at all. We're saying that we want you to speak up in a sense that, yes, is aggressive, is stern, because that's the only way people are going to listen to you, but also know that boundary between inciting violence and speaking up for your rights and what you believe in. And I say that because violence can also be incited online. And so this is not just peaceful in person, but if you're online and you're also threatening certain companies or people at companies that you don't agree with, I don't think that's a form of protest. I just think that's a form of trolling or adding to more violence. I personally don't agree with that. And so there is kind of a boundary and a limitation to harnessing your frustration and anger and rage and using it for something that can lead to progress. Because if you incite violence, it's just really hard to lead to progress.
If anything, it invalidates the case that you're making for the right that you're speaking up for or the action that you're speaking up for. It invalidates you.
And the cause sometimes, then people look at that and say, oh, I don't like that group because that group tends to cause violence and tends to, whatever word they decide to use, loot, riot, I don't know. We've heard that in the news, but sometimes those are just peaceful protests that go RE. So yes, it's kind of just having that in mind that things do happen and that's why you have to be prepared. But also you have to make sure you're not contributing to things happening and that you're making sure that you're following orders from the demonstrators, from the organizers, because they're the ones who know best.
Absolutely. And kind of to add to that a little bit further too, there are extreme ways of protesting. I remember one of the first protests, I believe it was one of the first Palestine protests, and I like immediately after I got back, I called Tanya or like I had asked her, hey, I was very confused. A few of the protesters there and the organizers there were purposely obstructing traffic or sitting in the middle of the street. But that was, they came prepared to do that. They were intentionally trying to get arrested because there are times, and this is a form, if again, it's whatever you're comfortable with. This organization, they coordinated it, they were prepared for it, but it's a form of it. We did want to call it out because, as I mentioned, I was very confused when I first saw it, but some people have the privilege to be able to be arrested to generate more attention and more media towards the cause, whether, again, that's your comfortability, the privilege that they may have, because not everyone is able to get arrested. I know myself, I could not, but just know that there are certain extremes to protesting that whether you feel comfortable taking part of, if you're not, you don't have to. We really want to encompass and really share that there are so many different ways, and not to necessarily say that like one is wrong or aside from the inciting violence, but there's a lot of extreme forms of protest as well. Recently, we're going to be tying back a lot to Palestine because it has been generating so many forms of protest. One of the forms being self-immolation, that being the form where someone decides to, in an act of really being vocal about their cause, choosing to set themselves on fire. It's a very extreme form of protest. Where it really kind of came about was during the Vietnam War protests. One specific individual decided to do that, I believe in Vietnam. Similar to what's going on in Gaza, I look at Vietnam similarly as a form of genocide towards Vietnamese people. And sometimes people are just so passionate, they're willing to take any means necessary to get their voices heard and taking that action too in solidarity with Palestine. One of the first major ones, he was not the first one. I believe there was a woman who had practiced this form of protest prior to, but one of the more public ones that came about was from Aaron Bushnell. He was ex-military and he chose to take this act because he felt embarrassed and ashamed of the US's specific involvement with what's going on and in the aid that they're giving to Israel to commit the genocide that they're performing against Palestinians. And again, it's not to say that necessarily it's a right or wrong thing to do, but it is just another extreme form, and it's something you may come across as you're learning more about protests. These causes are really, they mean a lot to people. There's a reason people are willing to go in week after week, protest after protest. Like I mentioned, I've been to 4 protests for solidarity for Palestine. There's a reason why people are so willing to support these causes.
Hunger strike is another one I thought of when you said that. The idea of putting your body on the line. And, people go to the hospital for that because after, of course, not eating for so many days, you need nutrients or else you put your body and life on the line. And yes, as Adriana said, this is not something that we're saying you should go out and do. We haven't done this ourselves, so we're definitely not advocating for that. But we are saying that there is a honor to that, I think, because these people decided to do it on themselves. Of course, if it is consent, if they consent to this form, and if they do it in a way that they feel is best. For example, in that case, in self-immolation, if someone decides to do that, they should do it in a way that they make sure no one else around them is threatened by the fire, because then it wouldn't be consensual. So that's just one example. Or for example, for a hunger strike, it shouldn't be forced onto someone. But assuming that this person really believes in this cause and is willing to do that, it just goes to show that these causes, again, aren't just on us. We know that they will continue because we are leaving a legacy behind, and they just have to continue because as much as we can protest in one lifetime, as we know with so many different causes that took centuries to protest. I mean, I'm thinking of right now specifically of chattel slavery in the US and across the Americas, and also specifically Indigenous land back. Those took centuries to protest in different ways. We're still feeling the effects of that. So just imagine how many generations they had to continue to pass on those legacies, to continue to pass on those forms of protest and what worked and didn't work. We know that this will continue. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think maybe saying that can feel like, well, what's the point? Like, how frustrating. Why am I going to get involved then if this injustice won't end in my lifetime, or if we're not going to reach the results I want in my lifetime? But that is also the beauty of it. If you think of it, of what you're passing down to, even if you don't have children, to just the next generation, and of building a better future. And you will see some results. You may not see the end all result. And I don't think there's necessarily, in a lot of these causes, it isn't necessarily we want one specific thing. We want more of like an idea, the idea of revolution, the idea of justice, the idea of transformation can look in many different ways in many different communities. So sometimes when it's more local, maybe it is we want to pass a specific ordinance, we want to pass a specific law or not, or we don't want this to pass. That could be very specific, and maybe, you'll see the results within a week or month or so. But sometimes it really is just calling out larger systematic things that won't necessarily unravel within a few weeks or generations or even a lifetime. While that can seem frustrating because it seems like we're going to just continue and continue this, I see it in the sense that if you contributed to this, you know that what you do now will continue tomorrow, and that's when you know you've made an impact. And that's the way, I see it. Do what you can while you're here and however you can, and it'll be worthwhile.
Definitely. And how can you not? We stress it so much how important collective liberation is and coming together. And how could we not want better for the generations to come? We are able to enjoy the fruits of the labors of the people that spoke up against all these injustices prior to us. It's only fair that we do the same thing for the generations that come. And to kind of wrap everything up too, is unfortunately fighting for justice is going to be an ongoing battle, especially when there are forces out there that will fight against it. Again, being from LA, recently there was an ordinance that's trying to be passed by City Council in LA, specifically the Public Safety Committee. They're trying to pass an ordinance, and we can link it in the show notes so that you can learn a little bit more. But an ordinance to prevent people from protesting in front of specific institutions, such as religious institutions, public institutions, health institutions. And you may be asking, Well, what's the problem with this? No institution is above public criticism. Unfortunately, injustices happen everywhere, even in these places where you would hope that it doesn't. And this ordinance is to keep people from protesting within a certain radius, what they call it a buffer zone. That's just one example of a way that our rights are being jeopardized, our freedom of speech. This ordinance is being brought about due to the encampments that were formed specifically in UCLA, and it's just a reminder of there's going to be challenges to our resistance, and we have to stay constant. We have to continue this battle, knowing that so many people who have done this in previous generations for us, I can't say that's not motivating enough to ensure that any jeopardization of our freedom of speech or our freedoms, any freedom, they should be able to expect resistance from us. And, protesting is just one way to combat these injustices that are committed against us. So we're really hoping that this exposes you more to what can be done and motivate you to continue to fight against these injustices.
I think my last comment will be that while these can all seem very intense at times, there is moments and there's space always for joy and for laughter in these movements as well, and protests as well. And that can even be a form of protest. Dance can be a form of protest. Uplifting art can be a form of protest. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that maybe you always see in the news. It can be any kind of skill or talent you have. And it should be in a way that feels like it is something that brings you passion, that you're doing it from a place of love. Because, I mean, we talked a lot in this episode about marching and how we've been demonstrating. And I shared how, for me, it does feel like it ignites a fire under me. But if that's not the case for you, there's definitely other ways that you can do it. I mean, if I could dance really well, then I probably would try that way, but I can't really. But someone else can. I mean, there's different ways to do it. And all of those, Dr. Shamel Bell, who I may have mentioned before in this podcast, she emphasized dance a lot in Black Lives Matter because she was very adamant about making sure that there is joy in everything that we do. And I think that's also recognizing that, like I said, this could be a whole lifetime that we do this for. You just can't stay in the anger and frustration and rage for a lifetime. That can be really draining. And so expressing all of those emotions in a way that feels like a relief, that feels like, oh, okay, I'm glad I'm doing this. I'm proud of myself of doing this. Whatever that is for you, then I think you're in the right place. You just have to kind of lean towards that and make sure that your skills and talents are being shown through, because we all have something to offer. So it's just about finding what works for you.
Absolutely. We do it all for love. We do it because we love our community. We do it because we love each other. Like, at the end of the day, every cause we fight for is for the people that we care about, the things that we care about. We hope that this was motivating for you. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Again, we're going to be sharing a lot with our show notes, a lot of resources. Please be sure to check that out. And we definitely want to hear from you guys more. If you've been to any protests that have been successful, we'd love to hear about it. If you have any upcoming protests that you'd like more support on, we'd also love to hear about it. So please, we want to form a community. We want to be here for you all. So never hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, and we can support virtually or in person. If you're in the Los Angeles area, in the New York area, or now in the Austin area, please let us know because yeah, we want to connect in person as well.
Yes, we're nationwide. Friendly reminder to follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Closing the Gap Pod, or to email us at closingthegappod@gmail.com with any questions or feedback. We all hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you on the next one.